Today's lesson is Beyond the Beaches, the legacy of D-Day 80 years later. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our program. My name is Roger.
And I'm Mike. And yes, we are looking at D-Day, or the legacy of D-Day 80 years later. Of course, it will be 80 years on June the 6th. Since June the 6th, 1944, that is the day that D-Day was actually launched. We're going to find out all about it in our article, so let's check out the first paragraph.
Beyond the Beaches, the legacy of D-Day 80 years later.
It was June 1944. The world was caught in the grip of World War II. German forces were occupying large areas of Europe, their control stretching east into Russia, north into Norway, south as far as Greece, and across France in the west. The situation looked bleak, but the tide was beginning to turn.
大家好，第一部分我们来看到名词 grip， 意思是控制、支配或是紧握。例如Andrew has a major grip on the company's human resources. Andrew 在公司的人力资源方面拥有重大控制权。又或者说 Mary's grip was so tight that the robber couldn't take her purse. Mary 的手抓得很紧，所以强盗无法抢走她的钱包。接下来介绍 occupy， 它是动词，指的是占领、占据或是占空间、时间。例如Demonstrators occupied the town's central square for several days. 示威者占据该城镇的中央广场好几天。或是 Lucy's toys occupy most of the shelves in her room. Lucy 的玩具占据了她房间里大部分的架子。下一个是形容词 bleak， 它表示情势惨淡的或是前景暗淡的，也可以是地方荒凉的或是凄凉的意思。举例来说The future looks bleak for the company as it has lost more money in this quarter. 那家公司这一季亏损了更多钱，前景暗淡。再看一个例子 After the war, the destroyed area seemed very bleak. 战争后，被摧毁的地区看起来非常荒凉。再来是片语 turn the tide， 它的意思是扭转局势或是力挽狂澜。我们可以说The boss is hoping that the new products will turn the tide and the company will start making money again. 老板希望新产品可以扭转局势，让公司得以再度获利。也可以说 The new president turned the tide for the country's faltering economy. 新任总统扭转了该国摇摇欲坠的经济局势。
Okay, so let's talk about D-Day, which happened 80 years ago from today. Today is June 6th, and that was the day of destiny. We're talking about D-Day. I think I did some reading about D-Day. Nobody really knows what the D stands for in D-Day. There have been different kinds of theories, but in my mind, the D is destiny, the day of destiny in which the Allies started to turn the tide against those awful Nazi Germans.
A lot of people say that. I believe it just means day. This is day.
The day, huh?
The day.
Day,
it was
day.
the day that they were going to do it, because every day afterwards was D+1, D+2. So they had all these sort of objectives that they wanted to reach. On D+3, we want to be at this town, or we want to be 40 miles from this place, or something like that. So yeah, it's a funny one that we say D-Day. We're kind of saying day, but that's what it's known as in history, and we're looking at the legacy of it. The legacy is sort of the history and what has affected, what has happened and how that has affected us in the time since then. So, of course, the world changed on that day, and we're still seeing some of those changes, with Europe being the way it is, the situation with the Atlantic powers being the way it is. So there is definitely this strong legacy from this great and important historical event. So let's find out about it. Well, it begins, it was June 1944. There we are. That's taking us back in time to the time of World War II. This was near the end of the war, which stretched from, of course, 1939 to 1945. 1945. So it was June 1944. The world was caught in the grip of World War II. Absolutely. Those war years were long and very painful for many people in the world. A lot of death, destruction, and sort of loss of life. And so this world that we lived in, or that people lived in at that time, was in the grip of this great war. The grip of something, when you hold on to something, that is gripping something. All right? So if you're in the grip of something, we're using this idea of holding in a less sort of specific way to kind of say, this has a hold on us, this is kind of controlling us. You could talk about a friend who's dating someone who isn't good for them, but they can't break up. They're in the grip of that person. If you're reading about some kind of religious leader, a guru of some kind, or a cult leader, they might have their followers in their grip. Or you could be in the grip of a disease or something like that. I spent all last week in the grip of a terrible flu that I had.
Oh, no.
It kind of controls you. I know, I feel much better now, thanks. It kind of controls you. It dominates your life, and you can't escape it, as if a giant's hands are holding on to you, have you in their grip.
Right. The world was caught in the grip of World War II. They were paralyzed by this war. Everybody was affected by it. Here in Taiwan, of course, we had a different situation in the Asian theater of World War II, with Japan controlling all sorts of territory in the area around Taiwan, and including Taiwan as well. But we're going to Europe here, and German forces were occupying large areas of Europe. Their control stretching east into Russia, north into Norway, south as far as Greece, and across France in the west. So if you know your geography, you know Germany is right in the middle of Europe there. And when Hitler started getting ideas about controlling parts of Europe, he spread out in all directions. The empire of the Nazis spread up into Norway and those other Scandinavian countries. I don't think they got into Sweden, though. They got Norway and Denmark, but I don't think they got Sweden.
That's right. Sweden stayed neutral.
And then, of course, they attacked the Russians as well. And then they went south and went into Greece there. And then they went over into France in the west because they were sick of those snobby French and they wanted to teach them a lesson.
Or something like that. Yeah, exactly. The situation looked bleak. Yes, it did. Of course, these German forces, they were staying in those parts of the world. That's why we use that word occupying. When you invade a country and don't go away, you are occupying that country. You've taken over the country, taken over the government. The people are now living under the rule of a foreign invading force, probably under the rule of the invading army. So this is kind of like what we're seeing going on in parts of Ukraine right now. Russia is occupying parts of eastern Ukraine. They have invaded and they aren't leaving. They are occupying the area. So the situation looked bleak, but the tide was beginning to turn. The situation in Europe, especially in the years 1942, 1943, it looked pretty bad. If a situation is bleak or if the outlook is bleak, it's not good news. There isn't a lot of hope on the horizon. There isn't a lot of good news coming around. You don't expect some change for the better anytime soon. Things are pretty bleak, and that's how it looked. But the tide was beginning to turn. The tide turns when the situation changes. Often when some team gets the upper hand, you might say the tide has turned. When the person who is dominating now starts to losing, and the one who is losing now starts winning, the tide is turning in the same way that the tides turn. Every 8 hours or so, you have a high tide, then a low tide, and then hours later, you have another high tide. In the same way, the situation was changing, and it started to change very quickly on D-Day. Let's find out more in the second part of the article. For several months, the Allied forces had been working on a secret plan. If it succeeded, they would gain land in Western Europe that could be used as a base for future attacks on German-held territory.
第二部分介绍形容词 Allied 这个字的意思是战争期间盟国的或是盟军的，也可以是同盟的或是结盟的。例如 The Allied forces finally came to help before the enemies almost broke into the city. 在敌人快要攻破城池前，盟军终于赶来支援。或是 Two allied nations work together to make more profits. 两结盟国共同合作，以获得更多利益。
Okay, in the second part of our article, it says, for several months, the Allied forces had been working on a secret plan. So, of course, during World War II, we had basically two sides. We had the Allies, which were us, the Americans, Canadians, British, Australia, etc., even China. They were part of the Allies. And then, of course, we have the Axis powers, which included Germany and Italy and Japan. But here we've got the Allied forces. And, of course, they were working on ways to defeat both Germany and Japan. And in this particular case, they had a secret plan that they were working on. And it was secret, so they didn't want the Germans to find out about it, even though the Germans spoke good English and they had lots of spies over there in England.
If it succeeded, it says, they would gain land in Western Europe that could be used as a base for future attacks on German-held territory. At this point in the war, Russia had been fighting the Germans in the east since 1941, and they were looking for some help. So the idea was that the Western powers, mainly Britain, Canada, the United States, would invade from the west, and this would allow both of these two army groups from the west and the east to start squeezing the Germans in between them. So this was the big plan, and this was why they had to land in Western Europe. But of course, the Western powers were based in England, so they had to cross that body of water, the English Channel, before they could get onto the land of Western Europe, the shores of France. And that, of course, was a very risky military operation. Let's find out more in the final part of today's article. As June 5th turned into June 6th, clouds hung over the coast of Normandy, France, and high winds brought rough seas. Not long after midnight, the whine of bomber planes filled the dark skies, followed by the sickening whistle of bombs falling to the earth. It was D-Day. Operation Overlord, the code name for the Allies' secret plan, had begun. After the bombers came parachutists, who had the challenging task of landing behind enemy lines at night in order to take control of roads and bridges. Then, with the sun beginning to illuminate the beaches, soldiers spilled from their boats and onto the sand. In total, it's estimated that nearly 160,000 Allied soldiers arrived on French soil that day.
第三部分我们来看到名词 whine， 指的是尖锐刺耳的声响，也可以是哀鸣声的意思。例如 The car made a whine with a sudden brake. 那辆车在紧急刹车时发出了刺耳的声响。或是 I could hear the whines from the dog that wanted some of my food. 我可以听到那只狗的哀鸣声，它想要吃我的食物。下一个是形容词 sickening， 指的是令人震惊的、恐惧的或是厌恶的。例如 The survivors of the tornado were met with the sickening sight of their destroyed homes. 在龙卷风的幸存者眼前是自己家园遭毁的骇人景象。再举一个例子 It is sickening that Ben makes such racist jokes. Ben 总是讲一些充斥着种族歧视的笑话，让人感觉很讨厌。最后介绍动词 illuminate， 它有照明、照亮或是阐明的意思。举例来说 The sun's bright rays illuminated Dina's bedroom in the morning. 早晨太阳明亮的光线照亮 Dina 的卧房。再看一个例子 The article illuminates the writer's struggle in getting their work published. 该篇文章阐述了作者为出版作品所付出的努力。
Okay, so let's continue talking about a bit of history here. As June 5th turned into June 6th, clouds hung over the coast of Normandy, France, and high winds brought rough seas. So this is the day before the invasion. June 5th turned into June 6th, and of course they were keeping their eyes on the weather. But unfortunately, it was cloudy there. Clouds hung over the coast of Normandy, France, where the invasion was to take place. They, of course, did quite a good job of keeping this secret from the Germans because the Germans, of course, were expecting an attack, but they didn't know exactly where where, and the Allies kind of tricked them into thinking they would attack someplace else when in fact they attacked at Normandy, which is the northern part of France.
Yes, indeed. And of course, they had to deal with high winds and rough seas, which are bad news if you're trying to invade a country from the ocean. The high winds, of course, will play havoc with the Air Force and also with anyone who wants to jump out of an airplane with a parachute. And the rough seas, of course, will make it very hard to load and unload the ships and bring the soldiers across the English Channel. But still, they decided to go since the weather for the next 2 weeks was going to be even worse. The weather forecasters decided that now was the time. So not long after midnight, early in the hours of June 6th, the whine of bomber planes filled the dark skies, followed by the sickening whistle of bombs falling to the earth. So that's how it all started. The planes took off in the middle of night, and soon they were over the coast of France, and they started to drop their bombs. So people there, both German soldiers in France, occupying France, and of course the French civilians who were still living near the coast, they heard the whine of bomber planes. The whine is kind of a high-pitched noise. So think of an engine running at a very high speed. Think of the sound of a propeller plane. Think of the sound of a blender as you blend up your juice in the morning or something like that. That kind of high-speed whirling sound of an engine moving, working very, very hard, working very, very quickly. So the sound of these bomber planes. Bomber planes are larger military planes that are designed not to fight other planes, but to drop heavy loads of bombs. If we're thinking of World War II, we're thinking of planes like the Lancaster bomber, the B-17, the B-24, the B-29. The plane that dropped the atomic bomb on Japan was the largest of the bomber planes during World War II. So they sent those across to soften up the beaches, destroy some of the defenses, and just basically bother the Germans. And so once the planes got over their targets, there was this sickening whistle of bombs. We describe it here as sickening, not because it makes you sick physically, but emotionally this would make you sick. Maybe physically with fear, but we're not saying it's making people actually sick. It's just terrifying people. If you've ever been bombed or heard bombing, you would know that the sound of the planes and the bombs falling, that whistling sound that they might make, would definitely terrify you, man, woman, child, soldier, or civilian.
Right, so if you're a Palestinian being attacked by the Israelis with bomber planes, or if you're in Ukraine being attacked by the Russians, the sound of those falling bombs will be quite sickening. You'll be very afraid and you'll be running for cover. And of course, that's what's happening when those bombs were falling on the Germans and maybe some innocent French civilians as well. It was D-Day. Operation Overlord, the code name for the Allies' secret plan, had begun. So again, this event is referred to as D-Day. It was also referred to as Operation Overlord, and that was the code name for their secret plan. I guess only they knew about this until later when they let everybody know that this was the name of that particular military action.
After the bombers came parachutists who had the challenging task of landing behind enemy lines at night in order to take control of roads and bridges. So this would have happened early in the morning, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning before the sun came up. Hundreds more planes would be arriving over France. These were not bomber planes. These were transport planes, and they would drop soldiers with parachutes. Parachutists or paratroopers, as we would call them in a military way. A soldier with a parachute who arrives at the battle by falling from a plane using a parachute would be a paratrooper. And they had a very difficult or challenging task. They landed, as they often do, behind enemy lines. So they're already landing surrounded by the enemy in areas the enemy already fully controls, but this will, of course, distract the enemy, make them very confused about where the bad guys are and where they're moving. And they did this at night to add to the confusion. And their main job was to control roads and bridges. If you've ever seen the HBO series Band of Brothers, which was very famous and popular, that was about the paratroopers, the parachutists, and their job was to control road crossings, bridges, small key towns, in order to allow the soldiers arriving on the beaches a few hours later, allowing them to move into the countryside much more quickly. But of course, many of those parachutists, those paratroopers, were killed either by accident, by falling into rivers and lakes, or by being killed by German soldiers.
Okay, so this again is happening on June 6th, but again, we were moving from June 5th on into June 6th, and they were looking at the weather, and then the sun began to illuminate the beaches. So with the sun beginning to shine on the beaches to light them up in the morning of June 6th, soldiers spilled from their boats and onto the sand. So again, to illuminate something means to provide light for something. It could also mean to give somebody some special kind of information. If you talk to a Buddhist monk, for example, maybe that monk will illuminate you as to some Buddhist teachings or something like that. You will be illuminated, or you will find fulfillment in what the monk says. But in this particular case, we've got soldiers spilling from those boats. To spill from is like, or as if they're being spilled from a bottle. That's what happens if you tip your cup over on the sink, then you will spill water all over the sink or the table or whatever. In this particular case, the soldiers were spilling out of those boats and onto the beach.
Absolutely. And of course, we also use that to describe the fact that they weren't getting out of the boats in an organized, orderly fashion. They were being shot at the time. So they were basically running out of the boats, climbing over the sides. They were falling out of the boats to try to get onto the sand, onto the land, and to safety. And most of them did, but of course, many of them did not. It says in total, it's estimated that nearly 160,000 Allied soldiers arrived on French soil that day. So in the 24 hours of D-Day, around 160,000 Allied soldiers arrived, and I believe around 9,000 or 10,000 were killed. That's an estimate that I'm making there. And when you make an estimate, it's kind of like an educated guess. You might know a few of the facts, you might have a lot of the information, but you don't know everything. You can't be 100% accurate or precise, so you make your best guess based on the information that you have. So it's estimated. Of course, with that many people involved in an operation of that size, it's very difficult or impossible to get an exact number, but that's a pretty good close number, 160,000 arriving in one day.
Right, so we've covered the initial phase of Operation Overlord when they actually began their attack, and we'll continue talking about how the attack ensued in the following days. We'll talk about that in our next program, but right now we're going to take a time out and listen to Hanny, our beloved Chinese teacher.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。课文第一部分的第二句写到 German forces were occupying large areas of Europe. Their control stretching east into Russia. 德国军队占领欧洲的大片地区，其控制范围向东延伸至俄罗斯。好，那我们看到这个句子里面它没有连接词，那前半句是完整子句，可是后半句的主词 their control 后方却接了分词 stretching， 所以这个句子其实有使用到这个独立分词构句。我们在介绍独立分词构句之前，我们先复习一下分词构句的用法。以对等连接词 and 去连接两个主词相同的子句时，我们就可以省略 and 和其中一句的主词，然后把那一句的动词改成分词 VING 或是 PP。动词是主动就用现在分词 VING， 被动就用过去分词 PP。 举例来说 He walked into his study, sitting down at the desk. 他走进他的书房并坐在书桌前。那么 sitting down at the desk 就是以现在分词 sitting 开头的分词构句。那么 sitting 是从 and he sat 简化而来，也就是去掉连接词，去掉主词，然后把 sat 改成分词 sitting。 好，那我们接着来看看独立分词构句的用法。以对等连接词 and 去连接两个主词不一样的子句时，我们可以省略 and， 然后把其中一个子句的动词改成分词。那要特别注意，这个用法当中两个主词是各自独立的，都不能省略。就像课文句子它原本可以写作 German forces were occupying large areas of Europe and their control stretched east into Russia。 这边我们就先省略了连接词 and。 那由于前后子句主词不一样，一个是 German forces， 一个是 their control， 那这两个主词我们都要保留下来哦。然后接着把 their control 后面的动词 stretched 改成现在分词 stretching， 那就会变成 German forces were occupying large areas of Europe, their control stretching east into Russia。 好，那最后帮同学们整理一下，分词构句和独立分词构句都是省略连接词，然后把其中一个动词改成分词的结构。差别就在于，当前后主词相同的时候，我们可以省略掉其中一个主词，那这时候是称为分词构句。那当前后主词不同的时候，就必须保留主词，这时候会称为独立分词构句。那我们最后就看一组例句哦。The girl stared at him, feeling surprised. 女孩盯着他看，感到很惊讶。那这边是用到分词构句。The girl stared at him, her eyes widening in surprise. 女孩盯着他看，惊讶地睁大眼睛。好，那这时候两个主词都保留下来了，这边用到的是独立分词构句。好，那以上今天重点整理，我们来回顾今天的单字吧。
Legacy.Dr. Cooper's discoveries left a scientific legacy that continues to shape our understanding of the natural world. Grip. The town found itself in the grip of an unexpected snowstorm, bringing life to a temporary stop. Occupy. When the war began, the enemy moved swiftly to occupy several towns near the border. Allied. The climate conference paved the way for an allied effort to address global environmental issues.Whine. The old ceiling fan made a constant whine that disturbed the otherwise quiet evening. Illuminate. Lindsay used a flashlight to illuminate the dark path through the woods. Estimate. Before starting the project, we'll estimate the time needed to finish it in order to better plan our work.Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of our program, and please make sure you join us again next time. From all of us here, I am Mike.
I am Roger. See you next time.